mental illness, allow me to introduce to you our humble and supportive facilitator. She designs, facilitates, and evaluates creative programs as part of her work in mental health education, prevention, and rehabilitation as the SAMH representative in East Community Collab. She works actively with partners to initiate collective impact projects that promote individual and community well-being in Singapore. She specialized in trauma-informed care training for the public and assisted in setting up SAMH Creative SAY, a neighborhood youth wellness center located at the north. She holds a BA in Development Studies from Brown University and MA in Creative Writing from Goldsmiths University of London. Please welcome Ms. Serene Goh.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here, and I'm really glad to be a part of this event. So I'm Serene. I come from Singapore Association for Mental Health. So we're a community-based charity for mental health and wellness activities. And where I situate myself is actually SAMH Creative Hub. So we do a lot of creative arts and wellness programs for the general public. So I was asked to join this event to speak about mental illness. Okay. Before I actually start, I want to just distinguish a little bit about mental health and mental wellness. Okay. So when I speak about illnesses, I'm really talking about mental health, and illnesses are very often diseases that are diagnosable only by a medical doctor. On the other side of the subject is mental wellness. So earlier, the stories that were shared about how people felt lonely when they were first here as a migrant worker, or how they felt a low sense of self-esteem, how they needed to learn to love themselves. Those may perhaps be considered topics in mental wellness, but depending on whether they were diagnosed with a mental illness, it may or may not have been an illness. Okay? So I just wanted to clarify that part before going on to share a little bit more about what I know about mental illnesses and maybe some stories of people I have worked with who live with chronic mental illnesses. Here I also want to self-disclose. I too have a mental illness. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia more than 10 years ago. I was one of the lucky ones because I responded very well to medication, and I have a very good support around me. Okay? So starting with this slide, what is mental illness? Okay, so mental illnesses are medical conditions. They're not something you don't just like say, oh, he has OCD, or he's very depressed, or she's very anxious. All these things are actually medical conditions that disrupt a person's thinking, feeling, mood, and ability to relate to each other. Especially if it affects your daily functioning, then that may be considered a mental illness. Okay? So just to say, psychiatric disorders are a true medical illness, just like heart disease and diabetes. So it's not so much just a mood swing, but a real psychological or medical condition. Maybe the next slide. Okay. And as a community worker in mental health, I do not do diagnosis. So I am not a person that people can come to ask, do I have depression or anxiety? For a formal assessment of mental illness, you do need to visit a psychiatrist or doctor. And some books that they use or some rules that they use to diagnose mental health conditions are like the DSM-5 or ICD-10, which you can look up online. Okay? And generally speaking, for mental illnesses, there is no single cause. It's more of like an interaction of factors. Very often, it's caused, there's some component of genetics, but really genetics is not all at play. There could also be other factors like loneliness, or even like bullying. It could be other causes, like maybe an event of grief or loss, that could have triggered the onset of mental illness. So there is no one factor. Genetics play a part, but it doesn't constitute the entire cause of mental illness. Okay. And for most common mental illnesses that I will go into a little later, I'll speak a little bit about depression, bipolar, anxiety, and also schizophrenia. And for all these somewhat common mental illnesses, not all the symptoms are the same all the time. And even if even if two people have depression, the severity and how it occurs outwardly can be very different as well. Okay, so just to keep that in mind. The last thing I actually want to say is about recovery. Okay, so in the hospitals or in the medical setting, they use the word recovery very different from how we use it in the community setting. In a hospital setting, very often they say, like maybe you have cough, you eat some cough mixture, and maybe after 2 days you feel better, you recover from your illness. So in that setting, recovering is really just getting back to normalcy and going back to the baseline of health that you were before. In the community mental health setting, we think of recovery not as going back to a baseline of health that you were before. We actually think of it as moving forward, ahead into the future, whereby you are able to actually create a new life for yourself that takes into account how you have already been diagnosed with a mental illness, but also, in spite of that, being able to create a valuable and meaningful future for yourself. Okay? So, a few notes: never self-diagnose. Okay, always, in some sense, work with a medical professional or psychiatrist to see if you really do have an illness, or if it's just maybe stress or mood swing from time to time. Okay, and now let me go into a little bit more about the different types of mental illnesses that I do see in clients in the community setting. So I'm going to read out these passages for each illness. I guess it's in line with the many writers and artists that are present here today. Okay, so for depression, this is a quote from Elizabeth Wurtzel. "A human being can survive almost anything as long as she sees the end in sight. But depression is so insidious and it compounds daily that it's impossible to see the end. The fog is like a cage without a key." Okay? So if you can get into the state of someone with depression, that is somewhat how it feels like. It's not about sadness, it's not so much about grief, but it's really about feeling this sense of hopelessness, having no end in sight, and being in a prison where you have no clue where the key is. Okay? So, and there are some symptoms of major depressive disorder. So, if we can just show So we can think about emotions, thoughts, behaviors, and physical observations. Okay, so for emotions, there is a kind of sadness that doesn't go away for depression, and very often we see clients who start to cry without us provoking them. They just seem to have a lot of sadness, and it comes out as crying. They may also feel very irritated and anxious, and they have excessive guilt about things that they may actually logically don't need to feel guilty for. And sometimes depression comes with anger as well. Okay, so thoughts, there's a lot of self-blame. Very often, if you are actually clinically diagnosed with depression, sometimes people also experience poor memory, and slow in thinking, and not able to concentrate very well. As for behaviors, okay, when you have depression, very often you have very little energy. You don't want to wake up in the morning, or you only wake up at night, and they often neglect self-care. So it's not uncommon for someone to, for example, not feel like waking up to brush their teeth or take a bath, all these things, okay? And physically, definitely, as what one of the speakers earlier shared, sleep is affected, and appetite as well, and sex drive, okay? Yep. So just to share, if a person is depressed, this is a question. If a person is depressed, there has to be an external factor bothering him. Do you think that's true or false? If it's someone with depression, yeah, you can think of it, the answer in your mind. And if we can go to the next one. So it's really false. So when someone is living with depression, it doesn't mean that there was an external factor causing them to be depressed. Actually, sometimes, very often, it happens internally. When they speak about trauma, for instance, it's very often not so much about what happened to you, but how your inside processes and changes as a part of the trauma. Okay? And a person with everything in life, all material comforts and no worries, cannot be living with depression. I think from the earlier speakers, you have seen that probably that's not very true. We can't judge a person, and mental illness really doesn't discriminate. Yep. Okay, so I move on to bipolar disorder. Okay, I feel like I'm giving a lesson here, so this is the topic. Okay, so this passage is by Kay Redfield Jamieson. She's a psychologist and a writer. Okay, so how she expresses bipolar disorder is this: which of my feelings are real? Which of the me is me? The wild, impulsive, chaotic, energetic, and crazy one? Or the shy, withdrawn, desperate, suicidal, doomed, and tired one? Probably a bit of both. Hopefully much that is neither. Okay, so for bipolar disorder, very often people describe it as mood swings. So you do have periods of very low moods and depression, but you also have mood swing towards the side of high moods and mania. Okay, so yeah, you see mania and depression. So I'll speak a bit more about mania now, because earlier I've covered depression already. So when we think about mania, we think like, oh, if you feel happy, it's actually a good thing. But sometimes it's not always good, because mania actually comes about, manifests itself as someone who feels like they are on top of the world. They may not have, for instance, a lot of money, but they feel like they can spend however they wish. So someone who is in a mania state could, for instance, spend their money very freely and carelessly, such that when they become normal again, or when they become healthy and in the right frame of mind, they will start to say, oh no, I've spent all this money, where am I going to pay for all these things for? Okay, so mania is a bit like that. And of course, there's like disconnected thoughts, flight of ideas. You suddenly become very ambitious, very dreamy, and you think that everything that you think about can actually come to fruition. Okay, so so that's mania. Okay, so I'll just move on to the next one. So now we think about anxiety disorders. Okay, so this is how someone describes anxiety. I get nervous about everything. Sometimes I literally don't know why I'm anxious. I just am, and no one seems to understand that. Okay, so again, when we talk about depression, we ask, is there an external factor that causes the person to be depressed? So earlier on I said no. Actually, very often it's an internal kind of reaction that enhances this feeling of depression. Same with anxiety. even though we can actually help a person who is anxious to feel less anxious, but really it's nothing super in the environment that causes the anxiety, more of how the insides react that creates this sense of nervousness. Okay, so move on. Okay, so some anxiety disorders, so one of the famous anxiety disorders is obsessive compulsive disorder. So you can think of obsessive compulsive disorder like this. You have obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. So someone could be obsessively thinking that something might go wrong or that their house might be burned down. And as a result, the compulsive behavior is really to check the stove multiple times or brush the teeth multiple times. Okay, so it's always an obsessive thought and then followed by a compulsive behavior. There are also other anxiety disorders like panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, but really one of the more common ones also is like social anxiety. So some youth do face a lot of social anxiety. They are afraid of what people think of them. They may have low self-esteem, and they are worried of how people will judge them in public. Okay? This may or may not be due to how their family members react to them, but I think social anxiety is very much about this feeling like when you go into a public environment or when you go into a friend group that you will be judged. Okay? Last one is schizophrenia. Okay, so this passage is written by Cornelia Parker about the experience of schizophrenia. My mother became mentally unwell with schizophrenia when I was in my teens. We couldn't watch television because she thought the people on TV were sending her messages. She thought there were hidden cameras everywhere, so we had to have the curtains down. Okay. So earlier I mentioned I have a personal experience of schizophrenia, so I can possibly speak to this a bit more. Schizophrenia is actually a very serious mental illness by any measure, and a lot of people who live with schizophrenia do live, I would say, subpar lives. Their speaking might be affected due to medication. Their hands may tremor because of the side effect of medication as well. And if the medication doesn't help them, they can continue to see people that are not there, hear things that are not there, or even feel a sense of touch when no one is touching them. Schizophrenia, you can think of it like this. There are hallucinations and delusions. Hallucinations are when your senses go out of whack. So it means that you see things that are not there, hear things that are not there, feel things that are not there. And on the other hand, there's delusions. So delusions is when you start to think about the world in a very weird and warped way. Okay? So for instance, you may think like, oh, this is a world where a mafia, a small group of people can control everything. They can control the weather, where the typhoon goes, whether your mother wakes up in the morning, things like that. It's really very like almost crazy and out of this world. Yeah, but people who have schizophrenia actually really believe that these things are true. Okay? So from a psychologist or psychiatrist perspective, they group this into positive and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms doesn't mean that it's a good symptom. It just means that your baseline behavior, things that are added onto it. So for example, you have hallucinations and delusions. And if we think about negative behaviors, it's again like your baseline behavior and what gets subtracted. So very often we have flat affect. So when you communicate with someone with schizophrenia and they are still in the height of the disease, you feel like they are not there. Yeah, you feel like they are not there, and you feel like they feel a bit catatonic in some sense. So even though you are communicating with them, it doesn't seem like they are communicating back to you. Okay? So I'm running out of time, so I just move on. So again, if we can just like click the slides. there are a few different kind of symptoms that you can actually identify in schizophrenia. So I just name a very short few. Okay, so like for instance, she's so lazy, she has not taken a bath for 2 days already. So what is that symptom? It's a loss of motivation, yeah, etc. Okay, so if we can go on. Yeah, so mental illnesses have become more and more common and more tracked in the local environment. And definitely a lot more work has been done in mental health sector, but really still there's a lot more to be done. Okay, so we go on. So as an end point with you guys today, I really just want to say that let's take care of each other. Actually, no one is really immune from mental illnesses. And we really do need to start to build personal strength and resilience, especially in this landscape where there are a lot of changes happening and there are a lot of challenges in our personal and also our communal lives. Yeah, so we really need to take care of each other. And one thing that maybe we can all reflect on is what is one thing you might want to do more, or one thing you might want to do less of starting from today that will actually help you take better care of yourself. Okay, so I think with that, thank you very much.